The signal came on a Tuesday. Not that the Galactic Council cared about Tuesday. They did not have Tuesdays. They had cycles and rotations and orbital markers, and none of them lined up with the small blue planet's insistence on dividing time into 7-day blocks named after dead gods. But it came on a Tuesday, and that detail would matter later. The Voth were the ones who found it first. They were always the ones who found things first: 4 arms, 3 brains, and a communications array that could hear a star sneeze from 2 sectors away. They were ancient. They had been ancient when most of the current council species were still figuring out fire. They did not panic. They did not feel panic. They had evolved past it somewhere around the 3rd millennium of their civilization. When they picked up the human signal, one of their 3 brains dedicated itself entirely to parsing it. It took 4 seconds. That was unusual. Normally it took less than 1. The Voth ambassador, a towering gray creature named Soveth, stared at the translation readout for a long moment. Then he forwarded it to the full council without comment. No preamble, no analysis, just the raw transmission and a timestamp. That was how the rest of the galaxy learned that Earth had spoken. The council chamber on the station Verdon Prime held 47 species at any given session. Some of them breathed methane. Some of them communicated through color shifts in their skin. One species, the Pelori, existed in a semi-gaseous state and participated through a containment vessel that looked like a lamp. They had been meeting every 40 rotations for 6,000 years. They had never once been quiet all at the same time. When Soveth's forwarded transmission played through the chamber's speakers, the silence lasted 11 seconds. For a room of 47 species with 47 different threat responses, 11 seconds of unified silence was something close to a miracle. Or a warning. It was Council Speaker Drevon, a 6-limbed reptilian from the Korathi Dominion, who broke it. "Play it again," she said. It played again. A human voice, male, calm in the way that something very large is calm, not because there is nothing to fear, but because the fear has already been processed and set down somewhere. The words were in the human language called English, which the Council's translation matrix had been cataloging for 63 years, ever since the humans first started leaking electromagnetic signals into space without any apparent awareness that anyone might be listening. The translation appeared on every screen in the chamber simultaneously. "You have marked our planet for what your records classify as Tier 7 dissolution. We have intercepted your council communications. We understand your reasons. We are not asking you to reconsider. We are informing you of a change in calculation. You have 48 of our hours to respond. If we do not hear from you, we will take that as confirmation that your decision stands, and we will act accordingly. This is not a threat. Threats require uncertainty. We are being precise. Earth out." The chamber stayed quiet for another 4 seconds. Then everybody talked at once. It had started, as most catastrophes do, with a bureaucratic decision that nobody important was paying attention to. The Galactic Council's expansion directorate processed roughly 900 planetary assessments per cycle. Most of them were simple. A planet had resources the Council needed, or a planet had a species that had reached a certain developmental stage and needed to be brought into the fold, or a planet had nothing useful and could be safely ignored. Tier 7 dissolution was reserved for a very specific category. Species that had developed faster than the models predicted. Species that showed signs of what the Council's sociologists called uncontrolled trajectory. Civilizations growing in directions that the existing galactic order could not absorb or redirect. It wasn't cruelty. The Council would have been horrified to be called cruel. It was mathematics. A Tier 7 planet was a variable that broke the equation. Earth had been flagged 18 months ago by a junior analyst in the directorate, a Pelori named Orvis, who had since been promoted twice and was not thinking about Earth at all anymore. The assessment had moved through 17 departments. Each one had signed off. Each one had assumed the department before them had done the hard part of the thinking. Earth was a Tier 7. The dissolution was scheduled. A fleet had been assembled at the edge of the system, 300 Korathi warships, and a Voth gravity anchor that could crack a planet's crust in 6 hours. The fleet had been sitting there for 11 days, waiting for the final authorization. Nobody had told the humans. That was standard procedure. You did not tell a Tier 7 species. There was no benefit to it, and the chaos it created was statistically worse than a clean dissolution. Nobody had considered that a Tier 7 species might figure it out themselves. The woman who had figured it out was named Yara Chen. She was 34 years old. She worked for a signals intelligence unit that technically did not exist, inside a building that was officially a data storage facility on the outskirts of Bangalore. She had a desk covered in empty coffee cups and a habit of eating crackers at 3 in the morning, and a brain that processed encrypted alien communication protocols the way most people process breathing. She had not slept in 41 hours when she cracked the Voth encryption. She sat very still for a long time after reading it. Then she called her director. Then her director called his director. Then that director made a call to a small office in Geneva that most people didn't know existed, and a woman named Director Hargrove picked up on the first ring, because she had been awake since Tuesday waiting for exactly this kind of call, even though she hadn't known what form it would take. It took 14 hours for the information to move from Yara Chen's Crackers and Coffee desk to the people with the authority to act on it. It took another 2 hours for them to decide what to do. The decision was this: they would respond. They would respond clearly. They would not beg, because begging required the other party to feel something like mercy, and they didn't know enough about the council to bet the planet on that. They would not threaten, because threatening required the other party to feel something like fear, and they didn't know if the council was afraid of anything. They would state a fact. The trick was figuring out what fact to state. That took 4 more hours and a room full of people who had not slept and were surviving on bad coffee, and a collective understanding that they were writing the most important document in human history, and that it had to fit in a single transmission, and that it had to land right. The man they picked to record it was a former UN crisis negotiator named Hendrik Botha. He had a voice like gravel settling, and a talent for making calm sound like a weapon. He recorded it in 1 take. Earth out. Back in Verdun Prime, the argument in the council chamber had been going for 6 hours. The Korathi speaker wanted to accelerate the timeline, complete the dissolution before the humans could act on whatever they were implying they would act on. A Tier 7 planet that knew it was a Tier 7 planet was more dangerous than a Tier 7 planet that didn't, and the fleet was already in position. The Voth said nothing. They were processing. The Helvani, small, bird-like creatures from the outer reach, who had been nearly dissolved themselves 4,000 years ago, and were now one of the council's most cautious voices, said they should respond. Find out what the humans meant by change in calculation. Find out what they thought they could do. They are a single-planet species, the Korathi speaker said. They have been in space for less than a century. Their most powerful weapon is a device that splits atoms. We moved past fission power before we had writing. What could they possibly do? They cracked Voth encryption, Sovath said. That shut the Korathi speaker up for a moment. In 63 years of passive signal exposure, Sovath continued, and his voice was the particular kind of flat that meant he was being very careful. They reverse-engineered a communication protocol that took our species 400 years to develop. They did this without knowing anyone was listening, without any goal except understanding. The chamber was quiet again. They are not asking us to spare them, the Helvani representative said softly. Read it again. They are not begging. They are not threatening. They say they are being precise. Precise about what? The Korathi speaker demanded. Nobody had an answer. That was the problem. Yara Chen was asleep on a cot in a back room of the non-existent building when the response came in. Her colleague, a man named Tors who had been watching the receiver for 3 hours without blinking, knocked on the door frame so hard he bruised his knuckles. She was awake before he said a word, sitting up, eyes already focused. They answered, Tors said. She was out the door before he finished the sentence. The response was short, 11 words in Voth standard, which the translation matrix converted in seconds. Identify your change in calculation. We are listening. Yara read it 3 times. Then she pressed her palms flat on the desk and took a breath that felt like the first real one she'd taken in 2 days. They were listening. Good. Because what came next was the part that was either going to save the planet or end it in the next 36 hours. And it depended entirely on whether the galaxy had ever met anything like what humans did when their backs were against a wall. She didn't think they had. She was not a particularly arrogant person. She did not think humans were special in the way people meant when they said special, chosen, cosmic, destined. She had read enough about the universe to know it didn't care about any of them. But she had also spent 3 years studying alien communication patterns. She had read everything the Council's intercepted transmissions contained about their history, their wars, their dissolved civilizations, their long, slow climb to dominance. And there was one thing she had not found in any of it. Not once, not in 6,000 years of recorded galactic history. She had not found a single species that, when told it was going to die, had responded by getting curious. No fear, no rage, no prayer. Just, what is this thing and how does it work, and can we use it? She pulled up a fresh document. She started writing the second transmission. The stars outside the window were the same stars they had always been, ancient and distant and completely indifferent. They had no idea what was coming. The second transmission took 11 hours to write. Not because the humans didn't know what to say. They knew exactly what to say. The problem was that what they needed to say had to be true, verifiable, and delivered in a way that a 47-species council that had been managing the galaxy for 6,000 years would not immediately dismiss as bluffing. The problem, in short, was proof. Director Hargrove had commandeered a conference room on the 4th floor of the Geneva facility and filled it with people who were not supposed to know each other. Physicists from 3 different countries, 2 cryptographers, a xenolinguist named Dr. Amara Osai, who had been studying the intercepted council communications longer than anyone and who had, in her personal notes, developed a theory about how the council calculated threat levels. Her theory was the reason they were not dead yet, or at least it was the reason they had a chance. They use predictive modeling, she said, standing at a whiteboard that was already covered in notation. Every species they've assessed, every civilization they've marked, every Tier 7 they've dissolved, they ran the same model. They project a species forward 500 years based on current trajectory. If the projection shows conflict with council interests, it's a dissolution. So they predicted us, said one of the physicists. A man named Dr. Volkov, who had the particular exhausted look of someone who had been dragged out of a very important experiment to deal with something even more important. They predicted a version of us, Amara corrected. The model is good. It's based on 6,000 years of data, but it has a flaw. What flaw? She wrote 2 words on the board. Adaptive chaos. Every species they've ever assessed followed a predictable developmental arc, she said. Even the ones that surprised them, even the ones that fought back. The Council's model accounts for resistance. It accounts for ingenuity. It accounts for desperation. She paused. It doesn't account for species that fundamentally change their behavior based on new information. Not tactically, not strategically, fundamentally. The model assumes that what a species is at the time of assessment is more or less what it will remain: bigger, faster, more powerful, but the same essential shape. Hargrove leaned forward. And we're not the same shape. We've never been the same shape twice, Amara said. The Black Death killed a third of Europe, and the survivors built the Renaissance. We dropped nuclear weapons on ourselves and then spent 80 years trying to figure out how to never do it again. September 11th happened, and we put a rover on Mars 12 years later, because apparently the way humans process trauma is to aim at something impossible and run toward it. The room was quiet. The Council's model, Amara said, has never encountered a species that treats an extinction-level threat as an asterisk research problem. The second transmission was structured differently from the first. The first had been a statement, a single calm stone dropped into still water, designed to make rings. The second was data, 47 pages of it, compressed and formatted in Voth standard notation that Yara's team had spent 3 years learning to write. It contained 3 things. First, a complete map of every Council communication the humans had intercepted in the past 11 years, not just the ones about Earth, all of them: trade negotiations, fleet movements, the quiet internal debate the Helvani had been having for a decade about whether the Council's dissolution protocols were still ethically justifiable, the Korath's private assessment of the Voth's declining population numbers, everything. It was a message inside a message. The data said, "We have been listening the whole time. We know more about you than you know about us." This is what a Tier 7 species does with 63 years. Second, a technical document. 22 pages of it. Dense and precise and authored by Dr. Volkov and 4 of his colleagues, who had stayed up for 19 hours straight and written, in complete and reproducible detail, the theoretical framework for a faster-than-light propulsion system. Not a prototype, not a vague sketch, a framework. The math worked. They had checked it 4 times. It was not the same approach the Council used. It was something else. Something that had come out of a human physicist's head when he was given 63 years of alien physics to cross-reference with Earth's own emerging understanding of spacetime. It was different enough that the Council's top engineers would need time to evaluate it. That was the point. Third, 1 paragraph, plain language, translated into every major Council tongue simultaneously. We are not asking to join your Council. We are not asking you to recognize us as peers. We are informing you that the species you assessed 18 months ago no longer exists. The species that stands here now intercepted your fleet movements, decoded your internal communications, and developed the attached propulsion theory in the time it took your dissolution order to move through your own bureaucracy. We are not what your model predicted. We suggest you run it again. As Soveth read the transmission alone in his quarters 3 times. Then he did something he had not done in 40 years of diplomatic service. He called his eldest offspring, not to discuss the transmission, just to hear a voice that was familiar. He did not tell his offspring why he was calling. He said he was checking in. He asked how the new clutch of eggs was developing. He listened to the answer with more attention than he had given anything in a long time. After he disconnected, he sat in the dark for a while. Then he sent a message to Council Speaker Drevon. "We need to postpone the dissolution vote." Her response came in 4 seconds. "On what grounds?" He thought about how to answer that. He had many answers. The technical one was that the humans had presented new information that materially changed the assessment. The procedural one was that a species that had demonstrated this level of intelligence in a passive monitoring context required a new full evaluation before any irreversible action. He sent the true one. "Because I am not certain we would win." The Korathi speaker's name was Grevontel, and she had lived for 240 years, and in that time she had presided over 9 Tier 7 dissolutions, and none of them had felt like this. The others had been clean, straightforward, a civilization that reached too far too fast without the wisdom to match the reach, a calculation, a decision, a necessity. This one had the council arguing in hallways. She walked through Verdun Prime's main corridor with her 6 limbs moving in the deliberate, even rhythm that her staff had learned to read as controlled irritation, and she reviewed what she knew. The humans had their fleet movements. That was a security failure of staggering proportions, and she was going to have a very unpleasant conversation with the Voth about their encryption at some point soon. The humans had a propulsion theory that 3 of the Council's best engineers had spent 6 hours reviewing and had not been able to immediately dismiss. The lead engineer, a Helvani named Pris, had sent a private note that said only, "The approach is novel. I need more time," which from Pris was the equivalent of another species saying, "I am somewhat concerned, please help." The humans had drawn a map of every private communication the Council thought was private. And they had done all of this not in response to the dissolution order, because they hadn't known about the dissolution order when they started. They had done it because that was apparently just what they did. Listened, mapped, learned. She stopped in front of a viewport. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been. "The original assessment," said a voice behind her. She did not turn. She recognized the voice, Orvis, the Pelori analyst who had flagged Earth 18 months ago. He had been summoned from his current posting, and he had arrived 40 minutes ago looking like someone who deeply wished he had chosen a different career. "You flagged them as Tier 7, she said. "Yes, Speaker." The criteria were met. All of them, Speaker. Rapid technological acceleration, non-linear developmental pattern, social structures resistant to external modeling, by every metric. "By every metric we had," she said. Orvis was quiet. "The model," Greventel said, "was built on data from species that had all, in one way or another, reached their ceiling. Species that grew fast and then stabilized. Species whose unpredictability had an outer boundary." "Yes, Speaker." "Did the model have a category for a species with no outer boundary?" Orvis's containment vessel dimmed slightly, the Pelori equivalent of a wince. "No, Speaker." She turned from the viewport. "Get me everything we have on them," she said. "Not the assessment, the raw data, everything they've transmitted in 63 years, every signal, every broadcast, every piece of art and music and argument and war. I want to understand what we're looking at." Orvis drifted toward the door, then paused. "Speaker, how much time do we have?" She looked at the timestamp on the human transmission. 11 hours before their deadline. "And if they don't hear from us?" She thought about the transmission, the calm in it, the precision, not a threat, just a fact stated by someone who had already done the math and was now waiting to see if the other party had done theirs. "Then we find out what act accordingly means," she said. She did not say what she was thinking. What she was thinking was that, in 6,000 years of galactic history, no Tier 7 species had ever made them wonder. This one had. That was, depending on how you looked at it, either the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered or the most interesting. She had not decided which. She had 11 hours. On Earth, in the building that didn't exist, Yara Chen was eating crackers and watching a clock. The room around her had the particular stillness of people who had done everything they could and were now just waiting. Tors was asleep in a chair. 2 of the physicists were playing cards in the corner, not because they were calm, but because their hands needed to be doing something while their brains sat with the fact that they had just sent an alien galactic council the equivalent of a very polite "try me." Yara was not playing cards, she was reading. She had pulled up Amara's notes on council psychology, the long ones, the ones Amara had been writing for 7 years. She had read them before, but she read them again now, looking for the thing she might have missed, the crack in the logic, the assumption they had made that was wrong. She did not find one. She found something else instead. A note in the margin of a page from 3 years ago, written by Amara in the small, neat handwriting she used when she was thinking rather than reporting. They have never, in 6,000 years of records, encountered a species that wanted to understand them. Every civilization they've met either submitted or resisted. No one ever just listened, got curious, tried to learn. I wonder if they even have a category for that. Yara read it twice. She put the notebook down. She looked at the clock. 9 hours and 40 minutes. She thought about the look on Tor's face when he knocked on the door frame and bruised his knuckles and said they answered. She thought about a woman named Amara who had spent 7 years taking notes in the margins of pages that might never matter. She thought about Hendrik Botha recording the first transmission in one take with a voice like gravel settling. She picked up the notebook again. She started writing down questions. Not for the council, for herself, because her brain had decided that the thing to do right now, 9 hours and 40 minutes from the deadline, was to get curious about what came next. She could not help it. It was just what they did. 6 hours before the deadline, the Helvani engineer Pris sent a second message to Council Speaker Grevontel. It was longer than the first. It said, "I have reviewed the human propulsion framework with my full team. We cannot find the error. We have been trying for 6 hours. There is no error. The framework is not only functional in theory, it is, by our current estimation, approximately 40 years ahead of where we expected this species to be in propulsion research. I want to be clear about what this means. This was not discovered. This was derived. They did not find this in our communications. They built it by cross-referencing our physics with their own and arriving at a third approach neither of us had considered. I do not know what to do with this information. I am sending it to you because it seemed important that you have it." Grevontel read it standing up. She had been standing for 4 hours. Her 6 limbs were tired. She did not sit down. The raw data on humanity was, by any measure, overwhelming. 63 years of electromagnetic signal, radio waves, television broadcasts, internet communications, military transmissions, private phone calls, music, arguments, confessions, jokes, eulogies. The Council's automated systems had been cataloging it since the first signals reached their outer monitoring stations, tagging and filing and largely ignoring it because that was what you did with a pre-contact civilization. You watched until they were relevant. Grevontel had asked for all of it. She did not, of course, actually consume all of it. That would have taken longer than 11 hours. What she did was sit in her private chamber with an analyst named Veith, young, meticulous, the kind of mind that could pull signal from noise, and ask him to show her the shape of it. "Show me their wars," she said. Veith had prepared for this. He had a display ready. The human history of warfare was not unusual by galactic standards. They had fought each other over land, resources, ideology, religion, and on one notable occasion, a significant amount of tea. They had developed increasingly terrible weapons and used them on each other and sometimes seemed genuinely surprised by the results, which the Council's psychological profiles had flagged as a concerning cognitive pattern. "Show me what came after the wars," Grevontel said. Veith hesitated. "Which wars, Speaker?" "All of them." What followed was harder to categorize. The aftermath of human wars was not, as it was with most species, either subjugation or stagnation. The defeated rebuilt. The victors argued amongst themselves about what to do with the victory. Both sides produced art about what had happened, enormous quantities of it, painting and music and written accounts and later visual recordings, all of it trying to process the thing that had occurred. Then, typically within 1 to 3 human generations, the same civilizations that had tried to destroy each other had trade agreements. "They forgive each other," Veith said, and then seemed slightly surprised by his own words, as if he had meant to say something more clinical. No, Grevantel said, look again. He looked again. They don't forgive, she said. They don't forget either, they carry it, and they build anyway with the weight on them. She stood up and moved to the viewport. The stars again, always the stars. Show me the disease, she said. He showed her the disease. There had been many. The Korathi, when they first became spacefaring, had been nearly eliminated by a pathogen that moved faster than their medicine. It had taken them 2 centuries to recover. Most species had a version of that story. A great dying, a long recovery, a careful future built in the shadow of the near extinction. Humanity had survived multiple civilizational plagues, the Black Death, the 1918 influenza, a sequence of outbreaks in the early 21st century that had killed millions in less than 2 years. How long was their recovery? She asked. Veith checked his data. They don't appear to have had one, he said slowly. In the traditional sense, the pattern in other species is mass death, societal collapse or near collapse, multi-generational recovery period, cautious resumption of prior activities. And the humans? They continued. During the plagues, they argued about the plague. Some of them denied the plague was serious while they were actively dying of it, which our medical analysts found deeply confusing. They developed countermeasures and distributed them and fought about distributing them simultaneously. Some of their artists produced significant creative works during the dying. Their economies contracted and then, within 18 months of most events, resumed growth. He paused. They do not stop, he said. I cannot find a point in their recorded history where they stopped. Other species stop. They reorganize and recover and then restart. Humans appear to restart before they have finished stopping. Grevantel absorbed this. 3 hours, she said. Show me everything about them in 3 hours. Skip nothing that surprised you. In the council chamber, the argument had been going for 9 hours without a break. The Korathi bloc wanted to proceed. 6 of their 7 representatives had voted for immediate action before the deadline elapsed. The humans had compromised council security in a way that the dissolution itself would not fully resolve. Those 11 years of intercepted transmissions were out there, in human hands, and a dissolution would not delete what they had already learned. This argument had a flaw in it that the Helvani representative pointed out immediately. Killing the humans now would not recover the data, and the Korathi knew that. They were not arguing for security. They were arguing because they did not like being outmaneuvered by a single planet species, and they wanted that fact resolved in a way that felt decisive. The Helvani wanted dialogue. They had wanted dialogue from the moment the first transmission came in. They were a small species and a cautious one, and they had, 40 centuries ago, been on the receiving end of a dissolution order that was stayed at the last moment by a council vote of 24 to 23. They lived with that math. They always lived with it. The Voth had not voted. Soveth had formally abstained on behalf of his species and refused to explain why, which was so unprecedented that 3 separate species had sent him private messages asking if he was all right. He was not all right, he was processing. Soveth had lived for 600 years. He had seen 31 Tier 7 assessments. He had participated in 11 votes to dissolve. He had done the math each time and found it clean and voted and moved on. He was trying to do the math now. The humans had cracked his species encryption. That alone should have been enough to tip the scale toward fear and away from negotiation. A species clever enough to do that was a species that, left alone, would become a genuine threat. That was the argument. That was always the argument. But Soveth had been sitting with something for 9 hours, and it would not leave him. The humans had cracked the encryption. Then instead of using it to disappear, to go dark, to hide, to buy themselves time, they had sent the message to the council that said, "We know what you know, and we want you to know that we know." They had revealed their advantage. In the game theory that governed galactic politics, that was not a smart move. You held your best intelligence. You used it when you needed it. You didn't lead with it. Unless, unless the intelligence was not the point. Unless what the humans were doing was not posturing from a position of strength, but something fundamentally different. Unless they were trying to talk. Sovath had spent 600 years in diplomacy. He had met species that posited, that calculated, that maneuvered. He had met species that screamed and species that went silent and species that sent poetry when they should have sent armies. He had never met a species that, facing dissolution, decided the most important thing to do was to make sure the other party had complete information. He raised his hand. In the Voth tradition, this meant he was about to speak and the room should be quiet, and the quiet would be maintained because when Voth ambassadors raised their hands, things of consequence followed. The chamber went quiet. "I am going to say something," Sovath said, "that I have not said in 300 years of active service." He waited. He had learned that timing mattered. "I don't know what they are," he said. "I do not mean that as a threat assessment. I mean it as a plain statement of fact. In 600 years, I have encountered no model that fits them. They have done nothing in the past 48 hours that any model would have predicted, including the ones we built specifically to cover non-standard developmental trajectories." He looked around the chamber, at the Korathi block, at the Helvani, at the gaseous light of the Pelori in their containment vessel. "I have one rule that I have applied to every significant decision in my diplomatic career," he said. "When you cannot model a thing, you do not destroy it, because you do not know what you are destroying." "You know what it is," Grevantel said from the doorway. The chamber turned. She had come in during his speech. No one had noticed. She walked to the center of the floor. She had the look of someone who had spent 3 hours consuming data that rearranged something fundamental. "You know what they are," she repeated. "You're afraid to say it because it sounds like you're defending them, and you are not sure that's the position you want to be in." Sovath looked at her for a long time. "What are they, Speaker?" one of the Korathi representatives asked. Grevantel had 6 limbs. She used 2 of them to pull up a display in the center of the chamber. It showed a visual readout of human history: wars, diseases, disasters, recoveries, collapses, rebuilds, launches, landings. "In 6,000 years of galactic history," she said, "every species we have encountered has had a ceiling, not immediately visible, sometimes very high, but present, a point at which their fundamental nature determines their trajectory and the trajectory stabilizes." She let that sit. The Korathi ceiling is political expansion. When you run out of space to govern, you optimize what you have. The Voth ceiling is observational. At a certain point, you have cataloged enough of the universe that new information shows diminishing returns. The Helvani ceiling is biological. You live longer than almost any species here, but your population is small and it stays small. She looked at the display. "I cannot find a human ceiling." The chamber was quiet. "Not because they have no limits," she said. "They have many limits. They have obvious limits. They are a single planet, a single star, a biological lifespan shorter than most of the species in this room. They die of diseases we cured 30 centuries ago. They go to war with each other for reasons our analysts cannot always parse. They have deeply irrational beliefs they hold simultaneously with rigorous scientific frameworks, and they do not appear to notice the contradiction." She paused. "But every time they hit a limit, every wall, every ceiling, every catastrophe that should have ended them, they do not stabilize. They do not stop. They treat the ceiling as a problem to be solved, and they solve it, and then they find the next ceiling, and they look at it with what I can only describe as asterisk interest. 1 hour to deadline." Orvis flagged them correctly, she said. "They are a Tier 7. Their trajectory is genuinely incompatible with the current galactic order as we understand it." She looked around the room. But I want to point out something about that phrase as we understand it. We built the order. We built it well for what it is. But we built it around a certain assumption that the ceiling was real, that every species reaches it, that we can model the future because the future follows from the past. She turned off the display. "What do you do," she said, "with a species for whom that is not true?" The Korathi speaker was quiet. The Helvani representative folded two of its wings inward, a posture that meant, in their body language, I was hoping someone would ask that. As Soveth lowered his hand, he had been holding it raised for the whole speech. Outside the viewport, somewhere beyond the reach of the monitoring stations, and the fleet and the gravity anchor sitting patient and cold at the edge of a solar system it had been sent to crack open, a blue planet was waiting for an answer. 47 minutes. The clock did not stop for anyone. It never had. The third transmission from Earth arrived 20 minutes before the deadline. Nobody had asked for a third transmission. The council was still arguing. They had not sent a response to the second one. They had not agreed on anything. They were 47 species in a room, and they had been going for 11 hours, and the Korathi block had shifted from destroy immediately to destroy within the week. And the Helvani were still pushing for dialogue, and Soveth had stopped talking entirely, which was somehow the loudest thing in the room. Then the receiver lit up. The room went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happens when something interrupts a conversation that people are already exhausted by. Not the dramatic quiet of the first transmission, not the stunned quiet of the second. This was the quiet of people who were simply too tired to be surprised and were waiting to see what happened next. The transmission was not data this time. It was a question. 47 words, translated into Voth Standard, then into every other council language, and it read the same in all of them. We have been watching your debate through the communication channels we have been monitoring. We are aware that you are not in agreement. We want to ask you something, not as a negotiation tactic, but because we find ourselves genuinely curious. What outcome are the species in that room who want us to survive actually hopping for? What do they imagine happens next? We would like to know. The Korathi speaker stared at it for a long moment. They are monitoring this room, she said. They are monitoring all council communication channels, Soveth said. We established this in the first hour. This is not new information. They're asking what we want, the Helvani representative said, and there was something in its voice that was hard to name, not fear, not surprise, but something adjacent to both. They're not asking us to spare them. They're asking what we want. It's a tactic, the Korathi speaker said. Is it, Soveth said. She looked at him. Or is it a question, he said. A genuine one, asked by a species that, as far as I can determine, is constitutionally incapable of encountering an unknown situation without trying to gather more information about it. That is a charitable interpretation. It is the interpretation supported by 63 years of behavioral data, he said. They ask questions, constantly, about everything. Their entire recorded history is a species arguing with itself about the answers and then building things based on the argument. They built the propulsion framework in the margins of an argument about physics they were already having. They sent us the intercepted transmissions not as a threat, but as, he paused, searching for the word, context. Because they thought we should have it. He looked at the message on the display. They want to know what we want, he said, because they are trying to understand the situation, because that is what they do. Nobody spoke. Answer them, he said. It was the Helvani representative who drafted the reply. Her name was Fenvi, and she was approximately 300 years old, and she had been in council service for most of those years. And she was, in the particular way of very old diplomats, tired in a way that went down to the bone. She drafted it quickly. She had been thinking about what to say for the past 3 hours, in the part of her mind that runs underneath argument and processes things quietly while the mouth does the louder work. The species in this room who argue for your survival hope for something that has no established galactic precedent. They hope that you are what you appear to be, not a threat that has been temporarily delayed, but a genuinely new kind of variable. Something the existing order can learn from rather than absorb or eliminate. They do not know if that is possible. The galactic order exists because it is stable. You are not stable. You have never been stable. The question we cannot answer is whether instability is always a danger, or whether there is a form of it that is something else. She paused. She added one more line. What do you want? In the building that didn't exist in Bangalore, Yara Chen read the response. She read it twice, then she called Amara. Amara picked up on the second ring. She was in Geneva. She had not slept. Her voice had the texture of someone who had been thinking so hard for so long that the thoughts were starting to show through the skin. Read it, Amara said. Yara read it. The line that mattered. They do not know if that is possible. Silence on the line. They're scared, Amara said. Which ones? The ones who want us alive or the ones who want us gone? Both, Amara said. The ones who want us gone are scared of what we are. The ones who want us to survive are scared of being wrong about us, of deciding to take a chance on us and then being right to be afraid. What do we tell them? Yara said. The truth, Amara said. Which truth? Amara was quiet for a moment. That we don't know either, she said. That we're doing this for the first time, same as them. That we are not stable, we know that, but that we are trying to be worth the instability. That we've been trying to be worth it for the entire time we've been a civilization, and we haven't always succeeded, and we know that too. That's not a very reassuring argument. No, Amara said, but it's the true one. And I think the ones in that room who want us to live are the ones who have been doing this long enough to know that reassuring arguments are usually wrong. The fourth transmission was written by Amara herself. Director Hargrove had wanted it reviewed by committee. There had been a heated 40-minute argument about that. In the end, Hargrove had looked at the clock and looked at Amara and said, 3 paragraphs, no committee, go. Amara wrote it in 8 minutes. You asked what we want. The honest answer is that we want what we have always wanted and have never been able to fully achieve. To understand things. That is not a polished answer. It is not a diplomatic answer. It is what we are. We have caused tremendous harm in pursuit of understanding. We have also built tremendous things. We are not asking you to ignore the harm because the things we built were interesting. We are telling you that the harm and the building come from the same place, the part of us that cannot leave a question alone. You are the largest question we have ever encountered. We have been listening to you for 11 years. We have tried to learn your languages, your physics, your history, and your politics. We have done this without any expectation of contact because we did not know contact was possible. We did it because you were there and you were unknown, and we are incapable of leaving unknown things alone. We don't know if that makes us safe. We think it might make us useful. We leave that assessment to you. She read it back. She changed 2 words. She sent it. Fenvi read it to the full council. She did not announce it. She walked to the center of the floor and read it aloud while 46 other species listened. And the room had the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of 6,000 years of an order that had never encountered this particular problem. And 47 different versions of the calculation that was running in every brain in the room. When she finished, she folded the document. I want to ask this chamber something, she said. Not as a speaker, not as a representative, as a 300-year-old diplomat who has seen every version of this room that this room has been. She looked at the Korathi block. When we dissolved the Varath, she said, we did it because their trajectory showed military expansion incompatible with our borders. We ran the model. It was clean. 18 years later, we discovered that the Verath had been developing a biological synthesis process that would have solved the Pelori energy crisis. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. The model didn't cover it. The Korathi speaker's expression did not change, but 2 of the 6 Korathi representatives looked at the floor. When we dissolved the Keth, she said, it was because their communication systems were interfering with our transit lanes. The model said the interference would get worse before it got better. We ran it. We voted. We dissolved. 40 years later, one of our own researchers independently developed the same communication method the Keth had been using. He described it as the most elegant solution to deep space signal coherence he had ever seen. She did not list a third dissolution. She didn't need to. The model is good, she said. It has kept the galactic order stable for 6,000 years. I'm not here to argue against it. She paused. I am here to point out that every dissolution we have ever conducted was, at the time, a clean calculation, and that clean calculations have a flaw. What flaw? The Korathi speaker said. Not hostile, genuine. They are made with the information you have, Fenvi said, not the information you don't. The room sat with that. The final vote on the dissolution was supposed to happen at the deadline. It didn't. What happened instead was that 4 minutes before the clock ran out, Soveth formally requested a 60-day review period under Article 7 of the Council's founding charter, an article that had been used twice in 6,000 years, both times in circumstances that the Council's historians later classified as situations requiring exceptional deliberation. The Korathi bloc opposed it. They were outvoted 16-5. The vote itself was not the remarkable thing. The remarkable thing happened after the vote, when the official notification was sent to Earth, a formal communication in Voth standard that informed them the dissolution order was under review, that the fleet would stand down from active targeting for 60 days, and that the Council requested direct communication. The response came in 19 minutes. It was short. Understood. We'll be ready. One request. Can you tell us how to get there? We've been trying to work out the transit coordinates from your fleet's approach vector, and we're about 14 degrees off on the primary axis. Yara sends her calculations. She thinks it's a calibration issue on our end, but she wants a second opinion. 3 members of the Voth communications team burst out laughing. This was not considered dignified. They apologized. They could not stop. Soveth read the message 3 times. Then he did something that had not been done in recorded Voth diplomatic history. He forwarded Yara's calculations to his own navigations team with a note that said, "Please review and respond. She is probably mostly correct." She was off by 11 degrees, not 14. The navigations team sent back the correction. Yara Chen, in the building that didn't exist, read the correction and said to Tors, who was not asleep anymore, "Told you it was a calibration issue." Tors said something that did not translate into Voth standard. Outside the window, the sky was the same sky, same stars, same indifferent dark. But somewhere in it, a fleet of 300 ships had just received a stand-down order. And in the council chamber on Verdun Prime, a 60-day clock had started. 60 days to answer the question that Fenvi had put in the air like a stone, dropped in still water. What do you do with a species that has no ceiling? What do you do with something the model never covered? What do you do when the thing you almost destroyed turns out to be curious about you? The stars didn't answer. They never did. That was something, Yara Chen would have said, that humans and stars had in common. They just kept going. The 60 days passed the way significant things often pass, faster than expected and slower than anyone wanted. The council sent a delegation. 5 ships. Not a fleet, not a show of force. 5 ships carrying representatives and translators, and one extremely cautious Helvani medical team that had been tasked with assessing whether humans could survive in the same atmosphere as most of the species they would be meeting. The medical team's report came back positive with 17 footnotes, most of which could be summarized as, "They are more physically resilient than they have any right to be. We're not sure how. We've noted it for further study." The delegation was led by Fenvi. This surprised many people on the council. Fenvi was old and careful, and had a reputation for bringing damaged negotiations back from the edge of collapse, which made her an excellent choice, and also the kind of choice that acknowledged publicly that this situation had some edge of collapse potential even in its most optimistic reading. She did not bring S. Soveth. He had asked to come. She had said no. "You already like them," she told him. He had considered this for a moment. Is that a disqualifier? For a first contact situation, it might be. I need someone who is still deciding. He accepted this without argument, which was itself a kind of compliment. The human delegation met them in orbit. Not on the surface. This had been a deliberate choice on the human side, something that Fenvi's analysts noted in their pre-arrival briefing with a small flag marked asterisk significant. Meeting in orbit meant the humans were not inviting the delegation into their home. They were creating neutral ground, a space that belonged to neither party. Either they had excellent instincts about contact diplomacy, or they had someone who had studied enough council precedent to know what the gesture would communicate. It was Amara, as it turned out. Fenvi met her across a table in a pressurized meeting room on a human space station that was, by the standards of galactic engineering, modest in every sense of the word. Functional, efficient, the kind of structure built by a species that had been in space for less than a generation and was still figuring out what it needed rather than what it wanted. Amara was shorter than Fenvi had expected. Fenvi, who was small by galactic standards herself, had expected the visual dominance that some species used in first contact, a deliberate display of physical impressiveness. Instead, Amara sat down, put a tablet on the table, and said, "We've prepared a briefing on what we know about your political structure, but before we start, I want to be transparent. There are probably gaps. We've been working from intercepted communications, and we know there are things that don't translate well. If we get something wrong, please tell us." Fenvi studied her. "That is an unusual opening," she said. "We figured honesty about the limits of what we know was more useful than pretending we knew more than we did," Amara said. "We've been doing this for a while. It doesn't work." "Doing what?" "Pretending," Amara said. "To other humans, to ourselves. It generally makes things worse." Fenvi set her own briefing documents aside. "Then let us begin honestly," she said. The talks lasted 9 days. They covered, in rough order, the formal status of Earth's Tier 7 classification and the conditions under which it might be suspended permanently, the question of what the intercepted communications meant for Council security, and what, if anything, the humans were willing to agree to in terms of limiting their use. The propulsion framework, which the Voth's engineering team had spent 30 days reviewing and had ultimately described in a formal report as a third path that we had not considered and cannot immediately improve upon, and the question of what precisely the humans were supposed to do now. That last question was the hardest. The Council was not designed for situations like this. It had 3 tracks for new civilizations: integration, which meant a species was developed enough to be brought in as a member and accept its assigned role in the order; observation, which meant a species was watched and left alone until it became relevant; and dissolution, which was permanent. There was no track for "we were going to dissolve you, and then you did something we didn't expect, and now we need to reconsider the whole framework." This was the thing Fenvi had come to work out. "What we are proposing," she said on day 4, when the foundational arguments had been aired enough that they could start moving, is a new classification. Provisional contact. It has no precedent. I want to be clear about that. We have some experience with unprecedented things, said Director Hargrove, who had flown up from Geneva and had the look of someone who had not fully processed the fact that she was negotiating galactic status in a room that smelled like recycled air and instant coffee. Provisional contact would mean Earth retains full autonomy, Fenvy said. The dissolution order is suspended permanently, not for a fixed term. In exchange, there are 3 conditions. She laid them out. First, Earth would share the propulsion framework with the Council in full. Not under license, not as a sale, a gift in the diplomatic language that the Council used for gestures that established the tenor of a relationship. Second, Earth would not expand beyond its own solar system for a period of 30 years without Council consultation. Not prohibition, consultation. Third, the humans would accept 1 Council observer on Earth, a permanent diplomatic presence, with full access to communication systems, public institutions, and whatever it was humans did that kept producing this level of output in this amount of time. Hargrove looked at Amara. Amara looked at Yara, who had come up for day 4 because Fenvy had specifically requested her presence after reading the note about her navigation calculations. Yara said, "The third one, the observer. Are they there to watch us or to learn from us?" Fenvy paused. It was a short pause, but it was the kind that meant the question had landed somewhere real. "Both," she said. "Then we'd want the same," Yara said. "One of us on Verdun Prime, same access, same terms." There was a Korathi representative at the table, not Grevontel, a junior member of the bloc sent to observe, and he made a sound that was somewhere between indignation and alarm. Fenvy held up one of her 6 limbs, not a commanding gesture, a quieting one. "That," she said slowly, "is a condition we did not anticipate." "We're a Tier 7, Yara said. "Unpredictability is kind of our thing." A long silence. "I will need to consult with the full Council," Fenvy said. "We know," Yara said. "We'll wait." The consultation took 18 hours. The Korathi bloc was opposed. Their opposition was coherent. Putting a human observer in the galactic seat of government was a security risk of almost incalculable proportion, given what a single human signals analyst had done with 11 years of intercepted transmissions. Giving them direct, legal, physical access to Council operations was the kind of move you looked back on in hindsight and called a catastrophic error. This was a reasonable argument. The Helvani countered it with a different argument. The humans already had 11 years of Council communications. The humans had cracked Voth encryption and developed novel propulsion theory, and sent a transmission that had stopped a 600-ship dissolution order in its tracks. The humans had done all of this from a single planet with no galactic contact, no support, and no reason to believe anyone was listening. "The question is not whether they are a security risk," Fenvy said. "They are, demonstrably. The question is whether they are more of a risk as an unknown factor outside the order or as a known factor inside it." She paused. "In my experience," she said, "the things you cannot see are the things that end you." The vote was 26 to 21. The Korathi bloc voted no. They would vote no for the next 30 years, in various ways, on various issues, until a Korathi physicist named Vental published a paper co-authored with 2 human researchers that completely reframed the galactic understanding of dark matter. And after that, the bloc's opposition softened into something more like competitive irritation, which was progress. On the last day of the talks, Fenvy asked Yara a question that was not on any agenda. They were in a side room. Yara had brought coffee, which Fenvy had tried and described as aggressively unpleasant in a way that seems intentional. Yara had laughed, which had startled Fenvy, not the laugh itself, but the texture of it, the way it contained something else inside it, relief or exhaustion or a week's worth of held breath. I want to ask you something personal, Fenvi said. Go ahead. When you cracked our encryption, Fenvi said, when you read about the dissolution order, what did you feel? Yara looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Scared, she said. And then? Yara looked up, curious. Fenvi had been expecting this answer. She had prepared for this answer. She had told herself she understood what it meant. 300 years of diplomatic experience and 60 days of studying human behavioral data, and she had been ready for it. It still reached her in a way she had not fully prepared for. Why, she asked. The fear I understand, the curiosity when your world is at stake, why? Yara thought about this. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound crazy, she said. But when I read those transmissions, when I understood what we were looking at, the fear was there. It was real. It was there the whole time. She paused. But underneath it there was this other thing. This feeling of we have been alone for so long. We thought we were alone. And then we found out we weren't, and the first thing we found out was that the rest of the universe wanted to end us. She looked at Fenvi. And somehow, in the middle of all of that, the main thing my brain wanted to know was why. Not because understanding it would change anything necessarily. Just because it was there and we didn't know and we needed to. Fenvi was quiet. We've always been like that, Yara said. It's not a strategy, it's just what we are. We can't leave a question alone. Even when the question is trying to kill you. Especially then, Yara said. The formal agreement was signed on the 10th day. 18 species signed as witnesses. The Korathi bloc signed as observers, present but withholding formal endorsement, which in council protocol meant they acknowledged the agreement was legitimate while reserving the right to argue about it for the foreseeable future. The document was 14 pages in Voth Standard and 2 pages in English, because when Amara had translated the full version she had condensed it, which was not standard practice, and when Fenvi pointed this out, Amara said, "We cut everything that was saying the same thing twice. We can add it back if you need it." Fenvi had looked at the 2-page version for a long moment. "Keep it," she said. 6 months later, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair arrived on Verdun Prime as Earth's first permanent observer. She was a xenoanthropologist. She had spent 14 years studying alien communication theory from a desk in Pune, and she had never been in space before the ship that took her there. And she had spent the first 3 days of transit in a state of overwhelming awe that she was careful to maintain quietly, because she had been briefed that some of the council species found human emotional expressiveness alarming. On her 4th day on Verdun Prime, she met Sovith. He had been the one to formally request her as the observer rather than anyone more senior. No one had asked him why. His reputation was such that people generally trusted his reasons, and his reasons were, in any case, fairly simple. He had been studying humanity for 60 days. He wanted to talk to one. "Tell me something," he said in English, which he had spent the previous 40 days learning because he found the structure of it interesting. The way it bent rules and then built idioms around the bends. "Tell me something about humans that the data did not tell me." She had been expecting protocol. She had spent 4 months preparing for protocol. She looked at him for a moment, recalibrated, and said, "We name our cars." He waited. "Personal vehicles," she said. "Most people give them names, not officially, just privately. Because we spend time in them and they feel like something. We know they're machines. We know it doesn't mean anything. We do it anyway." Sovith considered this. "Why?" he said. "Because we can't help it," she said. "We make everything into something. We make machines into characters. We make stars into pictures. We take the things around us that have no meaning and we put meaning in them because we're uncomfortable with empty things." She paused. "It's not rational. It's just what we do." Sovith was quiet for a moment. "The galaxy," he said slowly, "has many empty things." "I know," she said. "You would find that uncomfortable." She looked at him. Wouldn't you? He sat with that. 600 years of living, and he sat with it like it was the first time the thought had presented itself in that particular shape. Yes, he said. She smiled. It startled him, not the expression itself, which he had studied extensively, but the speed of it, the way it arrived before the thought behind it had finished forming. Good, she said. Then we have something to talk about. On Earth, in the building that didn't exist, Yara Chen was eating crackers at 3 in the morning and watching a new set of signals. These ones weren't encrypted. The council had given them access, partial access, formal access. The kind that came with 17 protocols and a list of things they were not to repeat outside official channels. She read them anyway, all of them. She made notes in the margins. The universe was bigger than it had been a year ago. It was also, she was beginning to understand, more confused by humans than they were by it. She found that deeply encouraging. She ate another cracker. She kept reading. Outside the window, the same stars. Always the same stars. But not empty anymore, full of ships and stations and 47 kinds of mines and 6,000 years of history. And one new classification that had no precedent and a 30-year consultation window, and 2 observers in unfamiliar places looking at unfamiliar things and writing it all down. It was not a perfect ending. The Korathi still didn't trust them. The dissolution order was suspended, not destroyed, which meant someone would revisit it eventually. The propulsion framework was going to cause political complications the humans hadn't fully thought through. There were 17 things that were going to go wrong in ways nobody had predicted. But in the building that didn't exist, a woman was eating crackers at 3 in the morning and taking notes on the universe, and she was not afraid of any of those 17 things. She was curious about them. That was, as it had always been, the whole story.